In this news roundup of the week for Friday, the 19th of April 2024, Ukraine is showing more and more signs of falling behind in the war with Russia, even as dramatic politics is playing out in the US Congress over whether or not they should get American aid. In Scotland, the government there abandons its ambitious climate net zero interim targets. Can the bigger targets be that far behind? And in Dubai, there has been a massive downpour and floods. Needless to say, everybody is coming up with theories as to why. Since I discussed it a couple of weeks ago, the evidence of how Ukraine's position on the battlefield is being compromised has continued to grow. The head of the Ukrainian army said a few days ago that the situation on the front has, quote, deteriorated significantly in recent days, and there has been an uptick in offensive operations by the Russians. The expectation now is that Russia will be launching a major offensive. It's suggested probably in June, although such dates are never fixed, with a view to making territorial gains in a more substantial way than seen since the early days of the war. Specifically, they will be aiming to seize all of Luhansk and Donetsk and to continue with other gains over time with the objective of influencing Western decision-making. The CIA Director William Burns gave a bleak assessment to US lawmakers where support for Ukraine has been held up over the last few months, saying that Kiev could lose the war by the end of this year without support. This situation feeds into an intriguing endgame being played out with Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson, who is now looking to try to get an aid package done, with considerable likelihood that the move, whether successful or not, could end up costing him his job. The challenge is that the MAGA Republicans in Congress have become increasingly anti-aid to Ukraine, even though mainstream Republicans remain of a view that it's in America's interest that Putin not be allowed to win there. But the current rules over what it takes to challenge a speaker, which is that a single discontent can initiate the process, and the wafer-thin balance of power in the House itself means that the deck is completely stacked against any individual who would show leadership in the name of getting something, pretty much anything you care to name, actually done in practice. Well, and so it is. Speaker Johnson is seen as one of the more hardline, MAGA-ish Republicans that could have attained the position. But that doesn't matter, because members such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, J.D. Vance seem happy to lob hand grenades into any situation that pursues goals that they don't share, apparently without any kind of a strategy as to how taking that action will lead to an outcome that meets their own strategic objectives, assuming they have any. It seems as though Speaker Johnson has decided to push ahead anyway, because he's become convinced that there will be major real-world consequences to not so doing, which will be against the interests of the country. This has been the result of seeing US intelligence of the situation that one lawmaker told Politico was pretty stark. So Johnson's now promoting a $60.8 billion bill to support Ukraine with a view to enabling to bolster its position in the face of Russia's offensive. And I mean, he might as well, because it's become clear that the outlier Conservatives are probably going to bring him down pretty much regardless of what he does do. In many ways, that frees him up to decide what's the most impactful thing he can achieve before that happens. One Democrat representative, Jim Himes, said of Johnson, quote, "I don't think I agree with him politically on anything, but I do think he has integrity, and I do think he's acting like a leader." The tone rather hints at the delicate balance being walked here, because you might have noticed it's an election year. If Democrats are too positive, it runs the risk of provoking more reaction against what's proposed from politicians who don't want to be seen to give candidate Biden any wins whatsoever before polling day, regardless of the real-world consequences. But at the same time, there has to be a degree of collaboration if a bill is going to get passed without all Republicans voting in favour of it. The bill doesn't only cover Ukraine, it also supports Israel and Taiwan. So it really is a moment when the GOP, with Trump as its election candidate, is confronting the question of how isolationist a place America can take in the world, bearing in mind the likely consequences of ceding large amounts of that space to Russia, to Iran and to China. Trump has pitched in by moaning that Europe should be giving more support to Ukraine, which, while it sounds attuned to his most MAGA supporters, nevertheless concedes the case that Ukraine's survival matters to the US. And he said this on his Truth Social platform. As everyone agrees, Ukrainian survival and strength should be much more important to Europe than to us. But it is also important to us. Get moving, Europe. Which at least sounds like someone weighing up what they might have to face should they be in government soon. In rather sharp contrast to Taylor Greens and the Gates, who seems to be happy to sink the ship that they're actually sailing on. Now, in one of the least surprising news items of the week, the Scottish Government has announced that it's abandoning what was described as a flagship interim climate goal. The Scottish Nationalist Party administration had announced that it would be cutting carbon emissions in Scotland by 75% by 2030, compared to 1990 levels. The Net Zero Cabinet Secretary, Mhairi McCallan, has now said this target was, quote, out of reach. The Scottish Government is also to scrap its annual emissions targets, which have been missed 8 times out of the last 12. One SNP Member of Parliament, granted anonymity to give them the freedom to say something completely bland and uninformative, said this: targets always have to be realistic, and if this interim goal no longer is, then there's no point pretending otherwise. Best to focus on more realistic pathways to get to where we need to be. The body retains, however, its target of reaching net zero by 2045, which is 5 years ahead of the target set by the UK. Many are confidently predicting that that too will be missed. After all, the UK set its 2050 target after it had a detailed report by the Committee on Climate Change outlining how it believed that timeline could just be met by 2050, so long as an ambitious programme was launched, the detail of which it laid out. It seemed as though Scotland, at that point in a state of permanent irritation with the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, had simply decided that anything the UK could do, it would do better, and so it just shaved a suspiciously round 5 years off the target with no particular plan detailed on how it was going to get there. Now, of course, maybe you could make the case that the target could be attained quicker while still retaining the support of the population for the measures being taken. Maybe you could make that case, but we wouldn't know because the detailed plan wasn't released, just a set of interim targets. Targets are not the same as having a plan. Now, in the event the UK government singularly failed to do most of the things the Committee on Climate Change plan called for as the early stages, and whatever Scotland had imagined it was going to do remained similarly elusive in practice. The Committee on Climate Change noted that Scotland must by definition be planning to go further than its own plan had laid out, but that it showed no particular signs of doing so. The Scottish Government urgently needs to provide a quantified plan for how its policies will combine to achieve the emissions reduction required to meet the challenging 2030 target, it said, hearing in response only the empty echo of its own words. Now, that's not to say that nothing has been done. In the UK, some of the easy stuff is certainly being done. But the more difficult measures, they are mostly being pushed back until after the next election. After all, the Conservatives are expecting to lose big time. So Why not let the next lot work out how to do the difficult stuff, or let them take the blame for failure? Either way. The new party of Nigel Farage, pestering the Conservatives from the right, have said that they want what they describe as the climate backlash to be at the centre of the UK election. That comes across as ambitious, as much so as the mirror image ambitions of parties like the Greens, who hope for the same level of profile for the issue, albeit with the opposite effect. Right now, it seems unlikely to be that high a priority an issue for voters, either way round, at least in the UK. This is hardly a unique process to the British Isles, though. While the easy things on the road to net zero continue to be done in the European Union, there has been a reining in of policies that, rather bluntly it must be said, attempted to go into the more difficult areas. The ability of governments to simply will into existence ambitious timescales by setting targets, rather than planning out both the detail of credible policies and the process whereby they win the support of the population for those policies, that has been shown to be unsurprisingly something of a busted flush. In the UK, the next government will almost certainly be one that retains the determination to keep momentum going. Whatever their version of that happens to look like, we may have to wait to discover. For the EU, the rise of parties on the right, largely aided by the backlash to some of those bluntly implemented policies, means that right now it's hard to predict what the landscape will look like there after the coming European elections. Bear in mind that in many countries, and it was certainly the case in the UK while it was still a member, national electorates often feel very disconnected from the European Parliament, so they feel quite free to indulge all sorts of protest vote instincts in the European elections, though they probably wouldn't do in their own national elections. So we could see some pretty spectacular lurches when the poll finally arrives. Meanwhile, Dubai has been having a lively time of it all by all accounts. The most famous city in a desert has had a phenomenon to deal with the like of which it hasn't seen before, namely a year's worth of rainfall in just a few hours, leading unsurprisingly to massive floods. Whatever else we learned from the occasion, it was a reminder that places that are not used to certain weather conditions don't build in a way that helps them to easily endure those unanticipated conditions. So Vancouver may continue despite lots of snow, Texas will snarl up after just 1 or 2 inches. And likewise, an East Asian city like Kuala Lumpur may shrug off the most dramatic of torrents, thanks to being built with the advanced drainage to cope with them. But Dubai, a very different story indeed. For a while, people were casting around for which ideological box they could slot this event into. Rumours went round that it was all the result of cloud seeding, which would have empowered those wanting to use it as a weapon to warn about the dangers of net zero lunatics messing around with the weather. Yeah, well, that didn't last for long. Firstly, although Dubai, because of its traditionally actually very dry conditions, it does sometimes engage in cloud seeding to get some rainfall, it had not been doing so before this downpour. And in any case, the technology of cloud seeding doesn't produce rain from nowhere. It can only make clouds already containing a certain amount of moisture more likely to release that moisture earlier than they otherwise would have done. So then others turned towards climate change and said that since warmer air is able to contain more moisture, this is exactly the sort of event expected to become more common as global warming proceeds. Now, that is true in those very general terms. But of course, pinning any one specific event to climate change is tricky. And even the methodology used to seek to do so, which takes some time before rendering a verdict, it's not wholly uncontroversial, even within the mainstream. But the point is that this event developed quite naturally, was able therefore to be predicted almost 72 hours in advance. A low-pressure weather system over the region, an anticyclone over the Arabian Sea, which helped to transport all that moisture into the region, leading to the dramatic result. Climate models, love them or hate them, do suggest that the maximum one-day rainfall amounts are likely to increase over the specific region as the world warms. So whether or not this event was the first sign of that happening or just an entirely natural forerunner of what is likely to come, if you're involved in infrastructure planning in Dubai, well, this might still be the time when you start looking at significant changes of how you handle drainage. This point was somewhat underlined this week by a new study that got a lot of news coverage, talking about how significant a decrease in GDP worldwide would be brought about by the progress of climate change. Specifically, 19% reduction in income within the next 26 years, worth $38 trillion a year. Now, this was interesting, up to a point. We've seen in the past certain models that made rather dubious decisions about how to make that sort of calculation. Bjorn Lomborg, for instance, is often using the figures to suggest that the impact of climate change will be really very tiny, economically, at least compared to the costs of climate action and indeed the size of economic growth. But the model he uses for that has been criticised on a number of grounds, for instance making the assumption that only businesses that operate outdoors would sustain interference or damage from climate change. Well, let's put it this way, I'm betting there's a bunch of businesses in Dubai right now who certainly don't fulfil that criteria, who will feel that they've learned the opposite lesson the hard way. Now, this latest study pushes the cost figure much higher than his model, indeed up to 6 times higher than would be the estimated costs of weaning off fossil fuels fast enough to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming. And it might well bear equally close examination of its methodology, something that we don't have the capacity to do right here for a topical news story. But I do note that this latest study is produced by academics tied to the Potsdam Institute, which, whenever you get a study saying that things are going to be way more apocalyptic than anyone thought, it almost always bears names of key people from the Potsdam Institute. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be right, or that they can't be more right, or that what they say can't be important. Just the same as I've said on this channel before, that Bjorn Lomborg asks important questions that the mainstream is unjustly resisting, even though his own answers to those questions are not reliable. The detail always matters more than the identity of the authors or which side they lean towards, since no one has a monopoly on wisdom. I would just reserve my judgment on this study when the people involved have such consistent form tacking to one extreme or the other. As I said, they can still be right. You should just check the detail and wait to see what sort of debate emerges from those with deeper expertise in the technical information. Maybe, as all of that plays out, it's a subject that we'll return to for a proper deep dive, because let's face it, it is a point of interest. Right now, I'm too busy working my way through Climate the Movie, which I should have a part 2 video on going live on this channel next week. Brace yourselves, it's going to be a bit longer than usual. And all the more reason, therefore, why I have to thank the people who support this channel on Patreon, without whose support I could not make these videos, long or short. If you would like to add your support, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. See you next time.